the Museum of Curiosity.
Hello, my name's John Lloyd, and I'm the Professor of Ignorance at the University of Buckingham. Welcome to the Museum of Curiosity, an institution that has grown so vast and improbable that it seems to have even taken on a life of its own and evolved into a conscious being who now wishes to be known as Susan. And here to do her hair and go shopping for shoes with her is the curator, Sean Locke. Well, Sean, what's been happening in the museum this week?
The shop's been doing very well.
Has it?
Yeah, been selling loads and loads of these anti-gravity machines. They've been flying off the shelves. I didn't even realise that when I was saying it.
Let's meet this week's steering committee, the face that launched a dozen television history series, Bethany Hughes, the highly controversial and mould-breaking biologist Rupert Sheldrake, and the soi-disant la-di-da clever clogs, Chris Addison. Now, before we cajole our guests into parting with their donations, let's find a little bit more about them. Bethany Hughes is a historian, author and broadcaster whose TV series include Athens and the Seven Ages of Britain, and critics have praised her for having made history sexy again, a claim that has sparked furious outcries from Tony Robinson fan clubs all over the world. Bethany, you actually started as a historian quite early, didn't you?
I did. I was 4. I went to see the Tutankhamun, or the Tutankhamun, as we have to say now, exhibition in London.
Was it Geordie?
Yeah.
Tutankhamun?
Tutankhamun. And I was inspired to write. So I wrote my mini biography all about this great prince.
How lovely. Can we have an excerpt, then?
Yeah, you can. I wish you could see the spelling. Tutankhamun, ladies and gentlemen, was a long time ago. He must have lots of men because he was rich and he was very, very nice. But one day, some, S-U-M, mosquitoes that were very germy bit him and he died.
You get Alan Titchmarsh reading that. It's a BBC One series.
I was 4. Right,
but honestly, seriously, Bethany, it's a good job it's radio, because even for 4...
Well, hang on, Bethany. In all the places you've been and all the sort of ages you've studied, is there a place or a time you'd have liked to have lived as opposed to now, do you think?
I think we're pretty lucky to live when we do, I've got to say. But the only place I would have loved to experience was Sparta in about the 6th or 7th century BC. Sparta was really weird. I mean, they were a very, very extreme society. And all the men from the ages of 7 to 30 lived together in a kind of military boot camp. So there were no men in the Spartan town. But that meant that the women were left on their own, and they had a fantastic time as a result. So they were allowed to drink wine, they were allowed to do horse racing, they owned property. They had this thing called polyandry, where if they spotted this gorgeous Spartan soldier walking by and thought he would sire me a particularly fabulous child, then you could invite them to your bedchamber.
I'm getting your drift, Bethany, yes. Do you think women have been sidelined, would you say?
I have to agree with you. Let's just do this. Name me the 6 most powerful women of all time.
Catherine the Great.
Who else?
Elizabeth I.
Yep.
Marie Curie, my mum. Any lollipop lady, they do a wonderful job.
Boadicea. I knew I'd get one.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, if you say that, name me the 6 most powerful men, people will argue for hours and hours and hours about it.
It's just a bit shocking, now you put it like that.
There was this empress of Byzantium called Theodora, who is the most fantastic character, and yet, I bet, has anybody heard of Theodora? She ruled the known world. She was the most powerful woman in the world in the 6th century AD. And she's got a great life story. She started off as a prostitute and the daughter...
I know this, but didn't she have a famous husband?
She did. Justinian was her famous husband, you see. And who built Hagia Sophia, the great church in Istanbul?
Well, it wasn't him.
Well, it was her.
It wasn't.
It was. But nobody's heard of her. So it is true that great women are just conveniently swept under the carpet, I think. Sappho, you'll all have heard of Sappho, who's a wonderful female poet. And do you know how we discovered Sappho's poems? They'd been used to mummify a crocodile. one of the most brilliant poetesses of all time, and yet that was the kind of value that was put upon these poems.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Bethany Hughes. The next member of our steering committee is Chris Addison. He's a poet, an award-winning radio writer-performer, a sitcom actor, and now a fully-fledged movie star with In the Loop. It was said of one of your shows, Chris, that if there were a comedy GCSE, you would be the set text.
And that is how to get audiences in. What do I want out of an evening of comedy? Is it multiple choice questions? This seems the man for me.
But you do deal with the ideas, don't you? You're talking
to a
about
point.
Theories of evolution and so forth. No, not
yeah,
really.
Oh, no, I do, but there's nothing goes in the shows that doesn't have a joke attached to it. That's the rule.
But you're not a scientist by training, are you?
No. In fact, I gave up science as much as I could before I got to my own GCSEs because I just had no aptitude for it. But the consequence of that is that I'm fascinated by it because it eludes me, I think.
When you get a really funny line, you know, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we know something's funny?
Well, often I think stuff's funny. It turns out it isn't.
Yeah.
Too bloody often.
I wondered whether you agree with this, Rupert. There's two ways of thinking. We're very proud of the sort of scientific method, but actually, don't we act more intuitively, don't you think?
Well, every creative insight, like every joke, involves making a new connection of some kind. And science involves some of this logical stuff, but if it didn't have any creative insights, it would be really boring and repetitive.
In the study of artificial intelligence, some people working in the field recently said that not only have we not created artificial intelligence, we haven't even got so far as to create artificial stupidity.
In the 80s, we were told these amazing computers were going to take over the world, and it hasn't happened. They've got computers that play chess, but artificial intelligence hasn't happened because intelligence doesn't work that way.
Plus, it means you can distract these computers by offering them a game of chess. You know, if they were going to take over the world, you just put a chessboard in front and they go, oh, I love this game.
Chris, you've actually written a book. 2 books.
Yeah.
How many books have you written?
I've written 2 books. 2 books, Addison, they call me.
Yeah, what's a book of poems?
A book of poems, yeah, a book of cautionary tales for grown-ups.
Is that in a sort of Hilaire Belloc style?
Yeah, that was the idea, but for grown-ups in the modern era. So there's faddish diets and driving 4x4s and emailing the news.
And can you tell us one?
Well, the 4x4 one is about a family. They've bought the 4x4 for the screaming children to protect them. It's so big that it gets stuck between 2 walls in a road and the child screaming explodes their skulls. So it has that kind of grimness to it that there's a man who is run over by a combine harvester because he talks entirely in business speak. He can't simply say help. It's available on Amazon.
Well, all by that, I'm sure. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Addison. My final guest believes that the universe has its own memory, that we have a 7th sense that tells us when someone is staring at us, and that the 80s supergroup the Nolan Sisters have telepathic powers. Rupert Sheldrake holds a PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge, a fellowship at both Harvard and the Royal Society. At a research institute in India, he developed a theory so radical that if he's right, it will reshape everything we think we know about the universe. So, Rupert, what was it like meeting the Nolan Sisters?
Well, it wasn't my choice exactly, but...
It's no one's choice,
no,
exactly.
They were fun. Some people on a television channel asked me to do an experiment on telephone telepathy. It's something I do anyway. And so I said, OK, you can film some of the people I work with. And they said, no, this is television. They said, we need celebrities. And I said, well, it's no use having random celebrities. You've got to have ones that know each other really well. So they rang me back the next day and said, we've come up with the answer, the Nolan Sisters.
They pulled an all-nighter on that one, apparently.
They couldn't afford the Jackson 5 then.
The experiment, briefly, is that you have 4 people calling you, and you don't know which one's going to call. They're chosen at random, the other person sits there, the phone rings, you know it's one of those 4, and you have to guess which before you answer the phone. The chance level is 1 in 4, 25%. Well, they came in at 50%, which is twice the chance level, enough trials to make it statistically significant. And similar to results I'd got with some of my other more talented subjects. The one who was guessing, Colleen, was in a hotel. Mm-hmm. We had 4 of them with me, and cameras and things.
Right.
And then one of them was picked. The rest of us left the room. They concentrated. I distracted the others, because obviously it wouldn't work if they were all thinking about Colleen. So I had to make them think about other things as best I could.
I don't know why that's funny, but it is.
So then one of them concentrated on Colleen, then rang her up. And Colleen had to guess which one it was.
Could you tell from caller ID?
Well, we thought of that. First of all, she didn't have caller ID on her phone. Okay. And secondly, they were all calling from the same phone.
Ah, very good. You use children to do these experiments a lot.
Yes.
Is there a particular difference in children as subjects and adults as subjects? Are one group more appropriate or useful or sympathetic?
Well, for the sense of being stared at, young children seem more sensitive than adults. The best children I ever did it with were my own, when they were sort of 4 or 5 years old. They got slightly tired of taking part in my experiments.
They don't want a phone gram.
No, they're the subjects of first resort, and they're beginning to price themselves out of the market.
But, Rupert, let me just say, consciousness, you know, obviously we don't know any more about consciousness, really, than we did when the ancient Greeks were around. Do we?
The standard view within science is that the mind is the brain, therefore your mind's inside your head. When you see things, like I'm seeing you now, light comes from you, goes into my eyes, inverted images on the retinas, changes in the cone cells, changes in the brain, and then a little John Lloyd appears somewhere inside my head. I'm suggesting something rather simpler, but harder to understand, namely, that my image of you is located exactly where you're sitting. My mind is reaching out through what I call a morphic field of perception to where you are. So I'm suggesting...
Where do you think the mind is, then? Is the mind...
I think it's in the brain, but it stretches out beyond it through fields, like a magnetic field is inside a magnet and stretches out beyond it. The mind reaches out to touch what you're looking at, and that's why people can tell when you're staring at them.
Given that everybody accepts magnetic fields, gravitational fields, and so on,
yes,
and that we know absolutely haven't got any further with the study of consciousness, why would people get so cross when you bring out some of your ideas?
My point is that science is not actually a dogmatic belief system, it's a method of inquiry, and if these things are happening, we should lighten up our view of what science is and how it works, and where our consciousness might be.
Well, I agree. Ladies and gentlemen, Rupert Sheldrake. Now, Sean, the magic moment has arrived when the museum opens its arms and welcomes donations. Mr. Curator.
Yes, thank you, Professor. The museum is now in the receive position. Bethany, what would you like to add to our collection?
I was going to offer Helen of Troy.
Okay, thanks.
Can I go now?
You're going to explain why. Why Helen of Troy?
Well, Helen of Troy is the world's desire, so she's pretty hot. Hot is her, of course, her initials, H-O-T, Helen of Troy.
Right. Where did you get that from?
So
Did she exist?
I still couldn't tell you whether or not she existed, but she was first written of 2,700-odd years ago by Homer in the Iliad, and there hasn't been a single decade in human history when she's gone off the radar. So I think she was a prehistoric princess based on these real amazing queens of the 13th century BC. They were brilliantly powerful and controlled land. They could decide who they married. They were beautifully rich. They're incredibly striking. Have any of you seen the snake goddess from Minoan Crete? And it's this woman standing, grappling these snakes. And she's got this fantastic dress on, which has been cut away so that her bosoms are bare. She's got these huge bosoms with erect nipples. I mean, this is all real, you know. It's not my daydreaming.
I'm enjoying it. Carry on. Mine, coincidentally. These are top shelf vases.
Actually, there's a fantastic little fragment. If any of you can read Hittite cuneiform, then I can't either. I've got to...
No, but I can rap in it.
Go on, then.
Cuneiform is writing, isn't it?
Cuneiform is writing. The Hittites, who were at the same time as the Trojan War, and they wrote everything down. And one of the things that they wrote down was about this beautiful princess, and she goes off to another state, and she has a dalliance with the prince, and the two states use this as an excuse to declare war on one another. And this is all written down in these little Hittite cuneiform tablets. And so that isn't fantasy, that's not some great kind of epic poem, that is what actually happened in the 13th century BC. So although I never say Helen of Troy existed, there is no question that they were incredibly powerful queens, and if you raped one of those, if you abducted one, it would have caused a war.
And I like the fact is it you created this measurement for beauty?
The Milli Helen?
Yeah.
No, sadly. It was scientists about 20 years ago. So the Milli Helen is the measure of beauty that would launch a single ship. But isn't there also a measure for ugliness? There's some sort of awful thing that... I don't know what it would be quite.
It's the Geoffrey Dickens, I think, isn't it?
No, it's the Widdicombe.
Oh!
It's only ever applied in fractions.
Well, a Millie Widdicombe, then, would be enough to scare away 1,000 ships, apparently.
And they're gurning at Dover.
Yeah.
Don't come near!
You don't want this land. It's full of us. But the idea, so she's very beautiful and proprietorial. Women are used as a sort of means of making bonds and alliances.
Yeah, because, of course, at that time, people thought that beauty was a gift of the gods. So if you were incredibly beautiful, then it would be thought that you were almost semi-divine. So beauty had real kind of totemic power.
Right.
I think it was quite hard to be very beautiful and very poor in the late Bronze Age, because you'd have been half-starved. You'd have looked pretty... skanky. Right. I think, there'd have been lots of cold sores and...
Covered in mud.
Exactly, digging somebody's soil and leprosy and all that.
Thank
Horrible,
God
horrible.
Cosmopolitan has done away with all of that.
Actually, what's fascinating about Helen is we all think of her as the most beautiful woman in the world, but if you look at the ancient sources, nobody describes her physically. For them, in fact, it wasn't important how she looked. What was important was what she made men do. This is what Joseph of Exeter wrote about Helen. This was in about 1184, and he talks about the meeting of Paris and Helen. Lying on him with her whole body, she, Helen, robs him of his semen. So this is written by a monk, so this is like before morning prayers. Oh, something I've just got to tell you about Helen of Troy.
Hang on, lads.
And as his ardour abates, the purple bed linen that was privy to their sins bears witness to his unseen due. What marvellous power in the gentle sex! Woman holds back her precipitate lust to obtain wealth and does not deign to give joy unless her smile has been paid for.
Right.
So it's Helen of Troy's smile into the museum.
Chris, we are still in the receive position. What have you got for us?
I have got Alan Shepard's golf club head, which he used to play 2 shots of golf on the moon with. And I like it because the Apollo moon landing programme was one of the greatest human achievements of all time. 400,000 men and women across America were involved in one way or another, most of them peddling. But what I really like about it is that it was an incredibly serious endeavour, and yet a human being in the middle of it thought, you know what would be funny? Playing golf on the moon. I love that. It humanises the whole thing.
Wasn't Alan Shepard the first American in space?
He was. He was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts who were superstars in America, bigger than film stars. But for me, as a lifelong nerd, there's something really great about the fact that there were these throttle jockeys. I mean, they were brainy, the astronauts, but they were men's men. And I really like the idea that nerds and jocks finally working together, the two natural enemies, came together to create this extraordinary moment in human history.
You obviously believe it all, then?
It cost $24 billion to fund the Apollo missions. That's a hell of an overspend on a telly programme. But no, it definitely happened. If they spent that much money, it definitely happened. Apollo happened in a space of 3.5 years. I was born halfway through that. By the time I knew about it, it was all done. That's the last time humans went into deep space, nearly 40 years ago. But the reason to go back to the moon now is as a way station to getting to Mars. So the next people to go will probably be the Chinese. In four
They did.
main
They went up
missions.
last year, didn't they?
The Chinese.
They didn't go to the moon. They went to space, though, didn't
Yeah,
they? And I
yeah.
thought it was very interesting the way that was covered. That was almost covered like that film Cool Runnings.
yeah.
It was like... There's that film about the Jamaican bobsleigh team. It's the way the press covered it, it's like, oh, look, the Chinese have managed to get into space. I don't think it was treated with a great deal of seriousness and respect.
Yeah. It's interesting you say, given that it cost 24 billion, about 175 billion in today's money to send those 12 men to the moon, and Buzz Aldrin actually kept his travel expenses form, which is framed on his living room wall. And it says Cape Kennedy, Florida, Moon, Pacific Ocean, amount claimed $33.31. And Alan Shepard, when he went on that 50-minute flight, the Navy paid him $14.38 in flight pay. That's all he got.
One of the astronauts put in a massive expense claim. I've been around the moon, and NASA rebuilt him for one space rocket at about $60 million. Well, fair enough.
Well, if you read The Right Stuff, Tom Wolfe's book, he talks about those great experimental jet pilots of the 50s, and they actually looked down on the astronauts a bit because they said it actually didn't take a great deal of skill to sit on hundreds of thousands of litres of explosive fuel. But they said you actually had to find quite stupid people to do it. I'm sure that Buzz Aldrin isn't a stupid man, or Alan Shepard.
When you look into the biographies of the astronauts, often they're men who are thinking, right, where are the most resources going? Where am I most likely to get to do fun things? And that's why they did it. They weren't people who'd gone, I must go to the moon. The explorers were the guys who were building the stuff, really. And the throttle jockeys, as brilliant as they were, very often weren't really trying to explore.
That's really interesting. So, Alan Shepard's...
Alan Shepard's 6 Iron, because it's the human part of the greatest exploration achievement that this species has made.
Excellent. Alan Shepard's 6 Iron in the museum. Thank you very much.
Rupert, what would you like to add to our collection?
A sheep rolling over a cattle grid. I imagine it'd have to be stuffed to keep the maintenance costs down. But anyway, that's it. One cattle grid, probably just one sheep rolling over it.
Right.
Perpetually frozen with its legs sticking up in the air as it rolls over.
That sounds great. No, you're talking about morphic resonance.
Well, since you mention it, yes. The ideas I have about morphic resonance, the memory in nature, means each species has a kind of collective memory. If you train rats to learn a new trick in one place, all the rats all over the world learn it quicker. So new patterns of behavior should spread. Well, sheep started rolling over cattle grids and escaping from fields in Wales in the 1970s. Never before been observed. Suddenly, the town of Blaenau-Festiniog was infested with
Just
sheep.
explain how they did that.
Well, cattle grids work very well. If the animals try and walk over them, their feet get trapped and they never try again. But somehow these sheep had developed a way of doing it by lying down and rolling across them and then getting up the other side. And suddenly they were all escaping from the fields.
Well, like a sort of commando roll, sort of
like commando rolls, yes. This
Cover
happened...
me, I'm going in.
They looked over their shoulders first, left and right, then...
The Welsh had to do something about it because they were escaping so much. They were eating people's front gardens and that sort of thing because they weren't used to having sheep coming out where they're not meant to be.
Are you sure this isn't an episode of Wallace and Gromit? Sure, I've seen this.
Then it turned up in Yorkshire, then in the New Forest. So it's spreading. Morphic resonance, it's a prediction. I can't claim it's a fact. It's a theory. It has to be tested scientifically. So far, it's taken a long time just for a few lots of sheep to do it. But once they get going, you know, more and more start doing it. So this is something I'm monitoring at the moment. I have an appeal running just last month in Sheep Weekly in Australia. And it's not been photographed. And the reason for that could be that it's a rural myth. But I'm actually thinking of launching a competition for the first videotape that could be put on YouTube.
So nobody's actually seen? Has anyone seen one roll?
Oh, people claim to have seen it, yes, but nobody's actually had their video camera with them when it's happened. We want to make sure that we can actually see the whole action, you know, not just frozen in the middle, because that could be posed...
Going, that could be 3, Barry. Just out of shot.
Yes. And now we've got an added complication.
Blokes zipping themselves into sheep costumes.
Stealing pyjama cases from their daughters. Presumably, it's a developing thought that they have. Just like any animal works out a new trick, a new way of doing something, it replicates what it does. Is it too much to imagine that, especially now they're broadly of the same species because we bred them in a particular way, that they might just be coming by this idea at roughly the same time because that was always going to happen?
Well, possible. You could argue that. But the point about morphic resonance is you can test it, you see. You can see if things get easier if more people learn
Oh, I
them.
see, OK.
For example, the Times crossword should be easier to do the day after tomorrow morning than tomorrow morning, the one that's published tomorrow, because so many people have done it. A lot of
the answers are in the paper.
Yeah.
Well, this involves doing it with people who have been excluded from seeing the answers in the paper.
Right.
And who are not allowed to cheat by
Right,
the internet. But a lot of people who do the Times crossword puzzle claim that it's easier to do the next day.
There's something that's always baffled me, that between 7,500 and 6,000 BC, you suddenly get all these female figurines all over the world, so in Peru and Romania and Turkey, all sorts of places where they couldn't possibly have had trade contacts. And they're incredibly similar. I mean, it's almost as if they've been built from one template. So in your book, is that morphic resonance at work?
Well, I don't know, and I couldn't prove it, but parallel inventions and cultural discoveries could work by morphic resonance. Evolutionary examples are the parallel invention in Australia in marsupials. You know, they have squirrel types, wolf types, and so on. They parallel a lot of placental mammal forms, and it's completely independent evolution. All this could be morphic resonance.
Well, we gratefully accept, Rupert Sheldrake, your wonderful morphic resonance and the stuffed sheep and the cattle grid in the museum. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we've got a 3,000-year-old woman who's nothing but trouble, the world's most travelled golf club, and a sheep rolling over a cattle grid. My thanks to our three splendid members of our steering committee, Bethany, Chris and Rupert, and I'd like to end with the words of astronaut Gene Cernan, the last ever spoken by a human being on the surface of the moon. He said, "Okay, let's get this mother out of here." Thank you very much, everybody. That's all from the Museum of Curiosity.
The Museum of Curiosity was curated by John Lloyd and Sean Locke, with research by QI's James Harkin and Molly Oldfield. The exhibits were donated by Chris Addison, Rupert Sheldrake, Bethany Hughes, and the producers were Richard Turner and Dan Schreiber. If you're the curious sort and you'd like to snoop around the museum's exhibits and prod them, please make your way to the Radio 4 website, where you can find out more about the Museum of Curiosity.